Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. I am very much looking forward to chatting with today's guest. He is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. He is certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and is an Oxford graduate and Rhodes Scholar. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest, Dr. Vishwajit Nimgaonkar. Dr. Nimgaonkar, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on this session today. It's really my pleasure.
Thank you. Today's topic is about depression, a heavy topic, but a very important one. Depression is a common and very serious illness that affects approximately 280 million people worldwide. And it seems to be that there might be some sort of connection between depression and creativity. So I would love if you could start us off by explaining some of the different types of depression and how they manifest.
So I think depression means different things for different people. In psychiatry, people have tried different types of classification over the years. I'd like to highlight two types of classification that I think are very important for this audience. The first is really what I call clinical depression and what most people think of depression. So I imagine that most people think of depression as sadness. So this is really a fact of life. We all have sadness. We all experience disappointments or grief or stress in this day of COVID pandemic. I think it's important to think of depression in that sense, but also in the sense of clinical depression. So what I mean by clinical depression is something that's more severe and of a longer duration. So if someone has been feeling sad or low or lacking in energy for, say, 2 weeks or more, then they're entering into the realm of clinical depression. Or if they have depression that's severe enough that it's affecting their work or their relationships, again, one needs to think about clinical depression. And if one is thinking of clinical depression, then one has to think of additional help that they need. And this is really a very important point because when you enter into the realm of clinical depression, then things become very uncertain because things can progress in a very unpredictable way. And from my point of view, the most important concern really is that people can get suicidal. And at that point, really need urgent and quite substantial help. So that's one classification I'd like people to think about, which is the sort of day-to-day depression, if you like, versus clinical depression, which is depression of a severity or duration that is longer than the normal sadness and disappointment that we all feel. The second classification I'd like to bring up is what people think of as major depression or clinical depression and bipolar depression. So within the realm of clinical depression, people can also have what is called bipolar depression. And this is part of a more rare condition, if you like, which is called bipolar disorder. So what happens in bipolar disorder is that people not only get depressed once in a while in a clinically depressed sense of way, but also at times experience what are called manic or hypomanic episodes. And here what happens is that the mood, instead of being depressed, goes in the other direction, where one is feeling elated to an abnormal extent or feeling irritated to an abnormal extent. And what I mean by abnormal extent is the elation or irritability is severe enough to affect one's relationships or working situation or of a longer duration than what we would see from day-to-day variation. So again, I should emphasize that we all feel elated, we all feel irritated, especially in the day of COVID. But if it's getting to a level where it's affecting our relationships or our work, or if it's a duration of, say, a week or more, then we need to think about bipolar depression. So these are very simple classifications, but I think they're really important as we go about our daily lives.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's very informative. And it makes me think, in terms of the artistic world, there are a lot of great artists for centuries that have been known to have depression. Van Gogh, Edvard Munch, Sylvia Plath, Charles Dickens, and of course, in the classical music world, we have Beethoven, Robert Schumann, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff. It makes me wonder if there's a connection between depression and the creative mind. Van Gogh, in a letter to his brother in 1888, wrote, "I am unable to describe exactly what is the matter with me. Now and then there are horrible fits of anxiety, apparently without cause, or otherwise a feeling of emptiness and fatigue in the head. At times I have attacks of melancholy and of atrocious remorse." In Rachmaninoff's case, for example, his symptoms were noticed first by his family and friends after the death of his idol, Tchaikovsky, and he was prone to bouts of depression and apathy during his career. During those periods, his composing would become sporadic. He even cut a piano tour short at some point because he lost interest and enjoyment in performing. And as you mentioned, it's important to seek help when these episodes last for more than just a few days. And in fact, Rachmaninoff's aunt suggested that he try a new treatment, which this was in 1900. This was a new treatment from Freud, of course, called psychoanalysis. And Rachmaninoff did take his aunt's advice. He did try seeing the therapist Nikolai Dahl. And by that summer, he was back to composing. But the question that this makes me think of is whether or not creativity is actually produced, if art is produced during these episodes of depression, or if the creativity actually comes back once these artists are coming out of the depression.
I'm really glad you asked that question. And in a brief way, the answer is yes. I think there is some evidence that people who are more creative are more likely to have depression. And I'm talking about clinical depression here. And there's also some evidence that people with bipolar disorder, which is the second type of depression that I talked about earlier, the bipolar depression, are likely to be more creative. So that's really an interesting fact. What I want to emphasize is that we are all prone to depression, the clinical depression, or to bipolar depression. So quite apart from this very interesting question that you brought up, I think the point to me is that we don't have to be creative to get depressed. We can all get depressed. This has happened to all kinds of people. And I'm thinking of people like Abraham Lincoln at this point. And the point that you made, though, is very important, which is that Rachmaninoff got better with getting some help from a therapist. So that's the point I really want to emphasize again and again, which is that if we are getting into a situation where we think we need help because we are clinically depressed, then there's no shame in asking for help. And in fact, you can get help that actually makes things better. Now, the question that I've wondered about is why should creative people be more likely to get depressed? And I can think of two reasons. One is that I think of creative people as being more intelligent than many of us. I consider myself not very creative as an artist. So I consider myself as part of the plebs, if you like. I think creative people are more intelligent. And I think that's one reason possibly that they are much more thoughtful. They think a lot about themselves and therefore are more likely to be sensitive to changes in their mood. That's one possibility. The second possibility is that creative people, again, I imagine, place a lot of burden on themselves. They challenge themselves just as athletes do, just as Olympic athletes do, for example. And I think they then put pressure on themselves, and possibly this might make them more prone to depression. So I think of depression as along a sort of continuum. I think of it as a line, if you like, going from 0 to 100, where at some point, your depression gets into a situation where you are in the realm of clinical depression. So if you another example that I think about is the spring model, where if you take a spring and you pull it, it springs back into its original shape. But if you pull it for long enough or hard enough, then it loses its elasticity. So in the same way, we can all get depressed, and we do get depressed when we meet with disappointments or grief or stress. Most of the time, we can spring back into where we are and we can go about our business and be creative. But there are situations where it's the stress is too long or it's too severe, and we cannot then get back to where we would like to be. So I hope that helps. And I'm really glad that you brought up Van Gogh's example. I consider himself as one of my heroes. He was just wonderful, and I feel really sorry that he did not get help, because people have wondered actually whether he not only had depression, but whether he had bipolar depression. So these are all very graphic examples and really lessons for us.
Thank you for your explanation. Artists often spend a lot of time alone, creating, traveling, practicing, and perfecting their art. And in addition, creative talent often manifests itself at an early age, thereby leading many down a very dedicated, focused, and intense path. Do you feel that this may cause feelings of isolation in life, which can potentially also lead to depression?
So I think that's another very important point, and I think you're right in some ways. I'd like to actually add to the point that you made, which is that yes, if we are lonely, we are more likely to be sort of introspective or to be more thoughtful or putting pressure on ourselves. Apart from that, I think the problem that we all have as human beings is that we have a really hard time judging ourselves correctly. So we either tend to judge ourselves too harshly or too lightly. And in both situations, it's very easy to get into a situation where we are actually clinically depressed, but we may not realize it. So that may be another reason, actually, that creative artists might be more likely to get clinically depressed, which is that they tend to be rather solitary at times, and therefore may not be able to judge themselves as well as they could. So it brings up a very important point, which is that depression again can slope off from a situation of sadness or disappointment that's transient into a situation where it's clinical depression, where you are in that situation of that spring that can't spring back to its original shape. So it brings up this issue that we need to be mindful that not only should we be trying to monitor ourselves in terms of our mood, but also be willing to accept from others comments to the effect that we may not be really in the sort of day-to-day depression, that we may be in the situation of clinical depression.
Thank you for that. I do have a question, though. I'd like to clarify something. When you speak about sort of judging ourselves, do you mean more being able to see sort of the mental state that we are in and how our lives are going? Is this sort of how many celebrities or maybe rock and roll artists end up going down a path of alcohol or drugs in order to sort of numb the feelings of isolation or depression or anxiety or disconnection from oneself?
That's exactly how I meant it, which is that we are not able to sometimes stand outside ourselves and look at ourselves dispassionately, and therefore not realize that we may be clinically depressed. That's point number one. The second point that you made also is very important, which is that very often we realize that we are not really our usual selves. We realize that we are depressed or maybe even clinically depressed, but we try and fix things ourselves. And I do believe that many people, including artists, try to self-medicate their depression. So they try alcohol or they try illicit drugs. And that's also very dangerous because none of these things actually can cure clinical depression. In fact, they make clinical depression worse. So it may be that, having a drink at the end of the day helps us to feel better, and in many situations helps us to get back to the normal situation, helps our springs to get back into their original shape. But if one keeps this up, and if one is getting into a sort of clinical depression scenario, then actually it ends up being a vicious circle where our clinical depression is actually worsened if we drink, certainly if we drink repeatedly. Because not only does drink affect our mental health at that point, but it can also affect our physical health and then make things even more complicated. The same is true for illicit drugs, for opiates or painkillers or crack cocaine and things of that sort, speed, amphetamine, and so on.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I suppose, whether it's an inability or an unwillingness to look at oneself in the mirror, or whether it in the past, for example, was simply that seeking help was very taboo. But I would say that it's really only nowadays that even celebrities, for example, the athletes, the celebrities, movie stars, it's nowadays that people are starting to speak openly about mental health, about depression, about anxiety, about going to therapy, about needing medication, about just sort of making these topics mainstream and allowing others to feel safe to actually have these conversations and say, hey, you know what, this is my experience too. And this person that I idolize is going through that as well. I'm not alone. I can seek help. I don't need to feel shame. But, I suppose shame is also closely tied with a lot of mental health issues, right?
Thank you for bringing up that very important point, which is really that we tend to stigmatize mental illness of different sorts. I'm not sure why, but the stigma extends not only from society, but also to the individual, where, many people who get depressed or are in that clinical depression situation feel somehow that it's their fault, that it's their own weakness. And this is unfortunately emphasized by society as well, which tends to kind of make the point that you need to be creative or productive all the time. And that's patently untrue. Some of us do get into a situation where we need help, where we are ill. We are certainly happy to take help if we are physically ill, if we are running a temperature. Unfortunately, society doesn't extend the same amount of understanding towards mental illness. And again, when you're in this clinical depression situation, it's a really sad fact that the individual themselves or society or a combination tend to make it less likely that help is available. And I'm really glad that certainly creative artists are coming forth and saying that they've had depression, that they've got help, that they've got better, because we can then use this phenomena in the reverse way, if you like, where we are trying to destigmatize and encourage help for depression.
Absolutely. And I was wondering if you might be able to share with us some sort of red flags that we can look out for, daily or weekly or common signs that perhaps one is sort of traveling down that spiral path towards clinical depression. And then afterwards, I will ask you also for tools to help us avoid going down that spiral.
I think there are two really important tools that we should think about. One is what I call self monitoring. So I think this whole issue of mindfulness, of looking at oneself at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, is really important. I think if we can reflect on how we are feeling when we wake up in the morning and or reflect on how we feel at the end of the day when we're going to sleep, even a few moments might help us to realize that that day might have been just the usual day or a worse day than usual, or a better than usual. And if we find that there have been 5 or 6 or 7 days in a row where we felt lousy, where it's not really seemed to have gone the way we would like it to, then that's a red flag. So I think the first very important way to look at this question is self-monitoring, looking at ourselves. And we can do this in many ways. And there are charts and so on that we can use. But in a very simple way, just spending a few minutes reflecting would be a very useful tool. The other second very important tool, especially in terms of clinical depression, is to use advice from people around us who are near and dear to us, because their views can be very important. And again, I think we can talk to people near to us. It might be a spouse, it might be a best friend, it might be a colleague that we trust, who can tell us, look, you've really not been doing so well for the last 2 weeks. I'm very concerned that you're not looking after yourself, or that you're having bad days in a row with colleagues, and so on. So I think those two tools, relying on oneself and then also relying on someone that one can trust, who can tell us in a non-judgmental way that things are not going well. I think those are really two important, simple tools that we can use.
Absolutely. I notice with myself, for example, thankfully have not had issues with depression, but I do struggle with anxiety. And what I notice when my anxiety is becoming worse, the symptoms of that tend to be mindless scrolling on my phone, or wasting time on social media, or feeling like I need to be in constant communication with someone. And I have learned to recognize that, and learned that that's the moment I will actually shut my phone off completely, because it's showing me that I am disconnecting with myself, and that I need to now disconnect from the outside world for a little bit in order to reconnect with myself, to stabilize, to bring back that feeling of equilibrium inside.
That's a really good point that you made. And again, I think the issue here is that, different kinds of disorders require similar measures, right? So I think you're absolutely right that when one is feeling overwhelmed, when one is feeling anxious, a good thing to do is to sort of step away and reflect and find some ways to feel better. And it can be done in many different ways. People use mindfulness, people use music, people use reflection, or even physical exercise. The other important point I like to make is that many people actually, there are different routes to clinical depression. So what I mean by this is that most people don't get clinically depressed overnight. Some people do, but most people actually, get clinically depressed over time. This seems to be a gradual process. And in many cases, one route to depression is anxiety. So one can get anxious, and this can get overwhelming if one doesn't take care or take remedial measures. And again, chronic anxiety can lead into clinical depression. So this might be another way to kind of be mindful. And again, not everyone who's depressed gets clinically depressed. That's right. Not everyone who's anxious gets clinically depressed, but this can happen. Again, going back to the story about bipolar depression, some people have a manic episode or a hypomanic episode and then get into depression. And again, I'm talking about clinical depression, not the day-to-day depression that we mentioned at the beginning of this chat.
Thank you for those clarifications. Those are very good points, very helpful, I think, points for anyone in any field, honestly, to think about. And I wonder if you could share with us some daily tools that we can use to sort of maintain balance, because at the end of the day, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, different mental health illnesses or disorders come from an imbalance within. Is that correct?
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think, again, going back to the point I made earlier, I think the best way of trying to avoid depression, if you like, or at least to monitor, is to spend time by ourselves and find ways of healing oneself. So we all have, stresses in our lives, and we have unexpected events in our lives that can get us off balance, if you like. And again, going back to the spring example, there are all kinds of things that make the spring get deformed. What the spring needs to be able to do is to get back into its original shape. And I think, again, we have to find things that work for ourselves. So some people find that exercise is a really good remedy for the stresses of life. And the exercise can be in different forms. We can go for walks, we can sprint, we can lift weights, we can do yoga, we can do Tai Chi. That's one form of trying to, heal ourselves. There are, one can listen to music, one can read, and so on. I think we have to find things that help us.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And what you said earlier got me thinking that, for example, with my own anxiety, it's not a chronic anxiety, it's not a constant anxiety, but it has been, I don't know if this is the correct clinical scientific term, but it has been a circumstantial anxiety. With COVID and with the last couple of years, it's been more around that. And I've also, since I began therapy, I've also become actually aware of the fact and have been able to name it and been able to recognize it, and therefore be able to actually work towards getting rid of it, if one can say that. But I do want to ask if with depression, with anxiety also, but with depression specifically, if you said generally clinical depression doesn't happen overnight, is it more that it can be, of course, gradual and sort of cumulative, but can it also be circumstantial? Can it also happen from, a specific life experience or trauma? And, how does it manifest itself in that way? And are the tools to come out of it or to diagnose it and deal with it the same as clinical depression?
So that's a really good point. And I think we all know from our experiences that what I call stresses or life events or environmental factors are very important triggers. So again, there are situations where we lose our near and dear ones, and it's normal to feel sad for that. It's normal to grieve. And I'm sure you're familiar with this idea of a grieving process. But that can then be a trigger for clinical depression. So again, I'd like to emphasize that all the things that we're talking about are part of normal human existence. Anxiety actually is a good thing because it can help you to be more creative. It can help you to perform better. But if it becomes excessive, it can then affect our functioning. In the same way, stressors that we have in our lives can be challenges that we can use to improve ourselves or improve our situations. But there are situations where challenges can also trigger clinical depression. The challenge again with these challenges is knowing when they are being helpful to us in helping us to improve or change for the better, or whether they are being stressors or being so excessive that they are affecting our functions in putting us on the path to clinical depression.
That's a really great point. I suppose it sort of relates to the concept of everything in moderation. Anything that's extreme can have generally a negative effect. And it's funny that you mention anxiety in small doses actually adding to creativity. I definitely agree with that. And we say, in the performance world that a little bit of anxiety, meaning adrenaline on stage, is good because it sort of heightens all our senses in that moment.
That's absolutely right. And we can think of depression in the same way, where, again, I imagine that creative people get depressed just like everyone else. I like to think that creative people are more sensitive than some of us who have more boring lives. And I can imagine that that sensitivity or the sadness can trigger some really wonderful works of art, some wonderful creative experiences. And I think, again, the literature is full of those kind of examples. And I'm sure you can tell me about musicians who compose some of their best works of art in a situation where they're feeling sad, either because of grief or something else. It's really the question of moderation, as you pointed out. I call it the cup of bad luck. So if our cup of bad luck gets filled up with too many bad things, then it's quite understandable that things overflow and then we get into a clinical situation where we need help from other sources.
Wow, yeah, I like that cup of bad luck. It's a good sort of visual aid and metaphor to keep us in check. And regarding artists, Van Gogh painted Starry Night while he was actually in the asylum, and that was his view. But it's not really clear with different artists, or it seems to be different with different artists, whether their creative streaks came from their depressive episodes or whether it came after. And as I mentioned earlier with Rachmaninoff, for example, during his bouts of depression, he barely composed. He was not really performing. Schumann, for example, we believe that Schumann was bipolar. And he unfortunately died in an asylum, struggled a lot with his own depression and his own mental illnesses. And again, times were different back in the 1900s. But today, of course, as we say, we have a lot more knowledge. We have a lot more education about it. We have a lot more research about it. We have a lot more conversation. So I hope that in today's world, things are becoming easier for artists and for all human beings. But as the knowledge and the awareness grows, so do unfortunately the difficult times, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And again, the point here is that it's very often difficult to disentangle depression from creativity, and they can feed into each other or they can be destructive for each other. And I think, again, this brings up a really important point that I want to emphasize, and it's something that we battle with in the clinic all the time. And this is a term that I call insight. And insight is a clinical term, actually. It says, are you really aware that something is wrong with you? And secondly, are you aware that you need to get some help for it? And unfortunately, mental illness carries with it this burden that many people who are mentally ill lose their insight. And this becomes a challenge in the clinic because everyone around this person thinks that they have a clinical problem, that they have clinical depression. Everyone except the person who's suffering from clinical depression. And this is an important point to be aware of and, again, to be sensitive to. And this is why I think really self-reflection, self-monitoring, self-care are so important, especially for creative people.
Is the inability to be aware, and is it just simply denial, or is it an actual cognitive neurological change that occurs?
It's a combination of the two. So you can imagine many people with physical illnesses who deny they have a physical illness. So many people with diabetes, for example, blood sugar problems, tend to deny it and go about their merry way until they get into really bad shape. It's believed that with mental illnesses, the sort of lack of insight or losing insight is really part of the clinical process. So Again, if you think of depression, for example, as a continuum, where on one end of the continuum, we are perfectly happy, we are perfectly normal. On the other end of this continuum, we have this really bad depression where we have to go into a mental hospital. I don't think those two are separate entities. There's really this pathway that we follow. And the reality is that if someone goes on that pathway from being happy towards really severe clinical depression, some people, not all people, lose insight along that pathway. So it really becomes a vicious feedback where losing the insight actually makes things worse and makes people more resistant to getting help. And that's very unfortunate.
I guess to your point, that's why self-awareness is really key, and being able to have people around you that can hold up a mirror and say, hey, I'm worried about you,
Yeah, thank you so much for putting it so nicely. I think, as you said, self-reflection and having a mirror.
Well, it's never an easy thing. And I think for many of us, at least I can only speak for myself, of course, but for me, I don't think I understood what self-awareness was until the last few years. And I certainly feel like I was, living on autopilot or without having any sort of self-awareness, just simply because I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the knowledge, and I didn't know. I definitely feel a great difference in the way I live in my day-to-day life with awareness, with the choices that I'm making or the way I'm trying to take care of myself on a day-to-day basis, but also how am I feeling? And is this something that is triggered by, let's say, the weather is very dark and depressing, or I haven't slept enough, or am I really struggling with something that needs to be looked at?
You're absolutely right. I consider myself luckiest person in the world. And one of the reasons for that is that I believe I'm lucky just to be alive, to have a body and a soul. And as part of that luck, as part of having that gift, I think it's very important for myself to look after my body and my soul. In a similar way, I think it's important for people to really treasure and consider themselves obliged to look after their bodies and their souls. And I think the beginning for that is really self-reflection and giving time for oneself, giving time to heal oneself or do things that one enjoys. And it might be just a few minutes a day, but it's really important.
What a beautiful thought and what a beautiful way to put it. Thank you for sharing that. I do have one last question for you, which is about genetics and whether there are connections between genetics and different types of depression.
So that's a really important question. And it's important because, again, there's a lot of misunderstandings about genetics. So we tend to think of genetics as what I call Mendelian genetics. So a lot of people say, well, I'm depressed because I have bad genes. I got depression from my mother or my father. And I think that's not quite the right way of looking at it. I think when we think of genetics, we need to think of it environment. So we are not all genes, we're not all DNA. We are really what we inherited from our forefathers and ancestors, but we are also what we are because of what we were exposed to throughout our childhood, and we keep getting exposed to our environment. So I think one needs to think of depression as having a genetic component, if you like, but that's not the whole story. So I think people get clinically depressed, not just because they have some bad genes, but also because they've been exposed to various things in the environment that, again, make that cup of bad luck overflow.
It's a bit of nature and nurture, right?
Exactly.
Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. I don't know a lot about depression. Thankfully, as I said, I've not experienced it myself, but it's something that I know affects the artistic community a lot. And I really appreciate you taking the time to help bring a little bit more awareness to this topic.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page @ConsciousArtistPodcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength to tackle this week, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of The Conscious Artist.